Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Awesome. Looks like you can hear me. Sorry for the delay. We were having some issues with getting everything up to the Twitch, but it's working now. So welcome to providing data context when presenting data. Looks like it's going to be a small group today, but super excited to talk about this with y'all. So my name is Gabriella. I'm with MLH, and today we'll be talking about providing data context when presenting data. A little bit of an overview of what we'll be doing today is first, we'll be talking about what is data contextualization and why does it matter. And then after that, we'll be talking about how to create data context. And then lastly, we'll be looking through examples of data contextualization and kind of pointing out what they did well with providing data context and how they could have improved. Some of these are from things I've done myself, and then a few are from other people. And if you have any questions throughout this time, feel free to drop them in chat. Thank you. Awesome. So a little bit about me is that I'm a coach at MLH, and I'm also a junior studying information technology. My name is Gabriella. So firstly, what is data contextualization? You might have heard something similar. You might have heard contextualization used in a different sentence from data, but not kind of together. It's not data cleaning, it's not data visualization, and it's not data engineering, but it can be related to all three of those things. Essentially, data contextualization is the process of finding related information about a data set or specific statistic and using that information to provide a frame of reference to the information. So essentially, you're taking relevant information, whether that be cultural, historical, demographic, or just about the data set itself, and putting that with the data and kind of adding a little bit more information so that the readers are able to kind of understand a little bit more about the data set or statistic and how applicable it can be to the world around them or their community. Data contextualization often makes a piece of data more actionable, and that's because when it provides a frame of reference, it allows people to see, is it applicable to them and their community? Or if it's not, like how can they do more research or gather more data to see if the findings apply to places that are closer to home, or answer any more questions they might have about similar data sets. Now we're going to kind of talk about, why does data context matter? Why are we talking about it today? And why is it something we need to learn how to do in the first place? So essentially, when you're just reporting on data, it allows readers to better understand the actual scope of the data and how it fits into their community, if it does at all, in the greater world at large. This kind of helps them to see if the data can be applied to their day-to-day life, or if that particular statistic just isn't relevant to them, or if they need to maybe do more research or ask more questions about learning more about it and how they can effectively use it for things like applying for grants, or just learning more about a particular medical condition, or activism. So all of those things kind of come together here. Additionally, data context is super important because it allows for engineers to have a better idea of where their machine learning models may have blind spots. And these blind spots can kind of be who's not represented in this data set, and also who this model may not apply to, and where it can be improved. Essentially, when someone isn't represented in a data set, the model might not apply to them just because there's not any historical data for the computer to have any background knowledge on them. So whether it be geographical location, a medical condition, could be anything under the sun, because machine learning is used in so many different ways. And another reason that data contextualization is so important is because of the biases that are baked into data. There's historical biases, there's cultural biases, and sometimes there's just biases that are baked into our data sets. And that's because they're collected by humans, and humans have a bunch of different kinds of biases. Historical biases in data are particularly important because they oftentimes exist in large sets of data that span over the course of many years. And these biases can be both due to the ripples of the past or the lived reality at that time. So for example, data collected on women or people of color may need reflected the additional contextualization of the different rights that people had at that time and how it could affect the future. Like, for example, women weren't allowed to open their own credit cards in the United States until about 50 years ago. So like that can change things about financial data even to today, or different aspects of economics or medical data are often affected by that. Tying into this, previous trends may creep into modern day data due to this. Kind of think about like, for example, big tech hiring and resume screening machine learning models. Some tech companies in the past have tried to use machine learning models to screen through resumes. A lot of companies do this. And essentially, it wasn't able to work correctly. It was just kind of pre-selecting for the largest group of engineers they'd had in the past. And as we know, the tech industry has been largely been made up of men and not people of color in the past. So this machine learning model was essentially grouping together characteristics of what they thought a good engineer would be and pulling out different resumes. For example, if they had gone to a women's college or something like that, that had no bearing on how good of an engineer they were or should like have been disqualified for that. So we're not able to oftentimes use machine learning models for different problems when we don't have data that isn't free of bias. And no data will be completely free of bias, but we definitely want to be cognizant of it and contextualize it. So in the future, we might be able to use an algorithm like that as the tech industry continues to become more diverse and we improve the data quality. Do we have any questions so far? Okay. Feel free to drop them in chat if you do. So next we're going to talk about data set inconsistencies. Just need some water. So sometimes due to human error or just financial and logistical constraints, data is not consistent throughout the entire set. It makes finding applicable insights more difficult, and it's not usually due to the fault of anyone. It's human error. Maybe someone just clicked the wrong button when they were filling out a survey, or someone accidentally deleted a cell in Excel. But other times it's more financial and logistical constraints, like the grant funding got cut, or they just like ran out of time before the end of a program or the data collection period. And that can often lead to inconsistencies or just the data not being the same quality or type throughout the entire set. Many people collecting data or even cleaning and presenting data won't have a statistical or data science background, and this can cause inconsistencies as well. So think, for example, someone who's an administrative assistant in an office kind of putting together some graphs or working through an Excel sheet to kind of provide some insights to the office. They might not have a statistical or data science background, but the data they're processing needs to still be of a good quality. So providing data contextualization of the kind of the background and the inconsistencies would be super important. And also someone who is possibly a grad student in like the social sciences realm won't have the same statistical training as someone who's in a data science field, but they still need to kind of be focused on the inconsistencies that could be present in their data set. And kind of data contextualization is a really good way for people who don't have a data science or statistical background to improve their data in the statistics that they're presenting to people, because explaining your data and your findings to people is it's arguably the most important part of collecting data, because you need to be able to show what it means to other people. Okay, so we're kind of going to move on to the next part of the presentation, which is how do we provide data context? So first, we're going to talk about data background. Kind of when was this data set collected, what questions were asked, what collection equipment was used, and is there control? As far as like when the data set was collected, that's really important because data that was collected in the early 2000s about technology isn't still going to be applicable because technology has exploded. Many more people have access to it. And there's been a lot of innovations that weren't present then. So the data will be very different. Also, like the way that the data is stored will be very different from the early 2000s to now. What questions were asked specifically in how they were asked, are very important, just because that can change the way that people answer them. If they were answered over a survey versus an in-person interview, like kind of how they were asked is very important, especially when gathering question-based data. Additionally, if you're doing something that's like more hard science-based or medical-based, what type of collection equipment was used is very important, because when presenting your findings, people want to know, was it industry standard? What was the quality of the collection equipment? How is the maintenance? Kind of how are you utilizing that? And also, is there control? Because we always need to make sure that our data is following some sort of scientific method so that we're able to find statistically sound findings. Moving on to the next important piece of providing data contextualization is consistency. Where first question you want to ask yourself is, where were the questions asked during the entire data collection period? Like, were they the same questions? Did the data collection device work the same way the entire time? Was the reading consistent? Were the questions consistently the same and asked in the same manner? Kind of in a way that we can expect the results to not be colored by just the difference in how the data was collected. Okay, looks like no more questions at this point. So also, transparency is super important when providing data context. And in the process of transparency, it's never going to be perfect, as is a lot of data context, because there's so many things you can do, and there's limited time constraints and people and just like the energy you have to do all of this. But transparency is super important because it allows the user to kind of do their own research and see how this data could be applicable to their everyday life or their community, or just like the questions they're curious about. And as far as transparency goes, detailing the process for data cleaning, visualization, context is super important, because it can kind of allow the user or the reader to see kind of how you got from the raw data set to the data you used, what you thought was pertinent to be visualized, and also for context, what you thought historically, culturally, and scientifically sometimes was necessary to explain why did you think this particular thing was important to include, but not the other thing. And that's helpful for the user to kind of make a frame of reference even more understandable, because it's explained and thought through pretty well. Additionally, I know this isn't always possible, but linking back to the original data set when you're making a data presentation or a slideshow or something is super helpful, just because it allows the reader to go back and do the math themselves if they want to, or just kind of look at individual data points, potentially if there wasn't any consistent findings for their area or someone similar to them, they're able to go back and at least look at a few data points that are similar to them or from their location. And finally, kind of providing the process for data collection, if possible, is super helpful. I know a lot of the times you're not doing the data cleaning and data visualization on data you personally collected. But if you are doing that, it's a really nice thing to include, because you're able to see the process for kind of like what questions were asked, how you structured it, who is being asked questions, who was the data being collected from, what was the setting, kind of thing. It just paints more of a picture and adds even more context and transparency throughout this whole process. Awesome. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Looks like my slideshow isn't working. Oh, it just went ahead for all those times I clicked. So sorry. Okay. Okay. So another important aspect of looking through and contextualizing data is demographics. And asking relevant questions about demographics is super important, because there's so many different types of demographical data. They're not always going to be relevant. They'll always help paint a clearer picture, but there's so many questions that usually helps to kind of narrow it down to things that you think would be relevant to that specific study or you're curious about seeing. And this is important for data contextualization because where and who the data is collected from really matters for who you're able to apply it to, like where you need to ask further questions in the future. If you weren't able to get questions from people from a certain geographic region, you might want to go back and do that in the future. So you're able to see if the same findings are applicable elsewhere. Some common demographics that are used for breaking down data contextualization, if you're talking about people, are gender and sex, race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and geographic region. And these can all be used together. You can use one or a few of them when you're contextualizing data. It really just depends on kind of what type of data set you're investigating and what you're interested in finding in your data set. Okay, so before we hop into the third segment of this presentation, let's take a quick break. Just a few minutes. I worked through the beginning part of this stream a little bit faster than I thought I would, but in like 2 to 3 minutes, we can hop back on and look through more different types of data sets and how they were contextualized, talk a little bit more about that. So we'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay, and with that, we're back. Can y'all hear me? Are y'all back? Okay. I hope you can hear me. Leave a message in the chat if you can. Okay, let's get started. So now we're going to kind of dive into some examples of data contextualization I've done in the past and kind of how you can implement similar strategies to your data presentations or data visualizations. I'll kind of talk about what went well with these examples and what could have been improved. And we'll kind of talk about that. If you see anything in particular like you think could have been improved or you think was done really well throughout any of these data examples, feel free to shout it out in chat and we can talk a little bit about it. So the first example, already went over this, is the salary transparency data contextualization. This one TikToker gathered a lot of salary transparency data, and I created some data visualizations and some data context with it on this website. So I will switch over to that screen. So as you can see, there's a lot of emojis and some graphs on the left, as well as different data. So the top one is age. And as far as this, I thought it was pretty self-explanatory when breaking down the ages of people who took the survey. I just kind of talked about how the average respondent is either in their 20s or 30s. And it just like kind of makes sense as the age breaks down. So yeah. The next demographic was education. Here we found that the vast majority of people who responded to the survey attended some form of college, whether that be an associate's degree, some college before dropping out, a bachelor's or a master's. And I kind of talked about which percentage had reported the highest level of education as a bachelor's and which is a master's. One thing that I think like would have been interesting to see here in the data set I mentioned was how much student debt the respondents have, because comparing the average salary versus the average college debt would kind of allow us to see what the return on investment was for the college degrees that most respondents have. And here kind of was broken down by the years of work experience. The survey was primarily done by people who were new to the workforce, with the top 5 responses of years of work experience being 1 to 5, which makes sense. I kind of talked about also how I would have been interested in collecting years of experience in the particular industry they were in, as it would have been a little bit of an indication of like how the salaries of a particular industry or if career switchers were similar, or if like how long you spent in a particular industry had any bearing on your salary. Yes. Additionally, there was the gender breakdown. There was a lot of unique entries. This is why the graph looks a little funny, just because there's like 0.04 like for responses that aren't as often. I talked about how the majority of respondents were female, followed by male, and then there were a lot of unique entries. I thought that it would also be interesting to gather like more gender breakdown data to see if there was any difference in salary between the people who filled this out who were cisgender versus trans people who filled this out. And then finally, we get down to the salary data itself. And I have the average, the highest salary, the 25th percentile of salary, 75th, and the median. Something that I noted here was that the salary data was the messiest out of all the different data points in this data set. Respondents were given a text box entry form, which made the data not standardized, even though it was numbers. And also, there were people who filled this out from all over the world. So obviously, there's different currencies. So I wasn't able to go through and convert every single item to the same currency, just because there was a massive amount of data and I wasn't able to figure out how to do that. But the majority of respondents were in USD. But it was just like interesting to see this, as well as removing the outlier and other information to kind of gain some more insight into the salary data. Oh, I was not sharing my screen throughout the entire time. I am so sorry. Essentially, I've just been talking through this data contextualization and graph thing I had created based on the survey. I am so sorry about that. So as you can see at the bottom, or throughout this entire thing, I have the graph on the left and then some contextualization on the right. And then kind of overall things I think like went well and could have been improved on this. I think that for the contextualization, I shouldn't have been as wordy. I think a lot of it was helpful, but when going through a data presentation, people I think want a little bit more concise data contextualization. So maybe if I had figured out a way to have my context be more visual or just more concise, that could have been helpful. And I also think that here I could have linked the data set I was using. I do have it because it was created by that one TikToker. But overall, I think I did a pretty good job here with having a pretty standard layout so people were able to easily follow everything. And I also added some emojis for some more aesthetic appeal. But there's definitely a few things that I could have done to improve. Does anyone have any other things that you think are well with data contextualization on this particular screen? What you think could be improved? And feel free to leave those comments on like what you think went well with data contextualization versus what could have been improved for all of these different ones I'll go through. If no one has anything to add for this one, I'll probably move on to the next example. This next example is a project I worked on for a hackathon about New York City school data. So I will share that. Okay, and as you can see, this is a Google Colab tool. I think it's pretty helpful for creating graphs really quickly and cleaning data. I used Plotly in combination with Colab, which is a really good data visualization tool. You're able to create graphs really easily with not a ton of code, and it breaks it down for you pretty easily. It adds the percentages, different items, and different data sets, which can be really helpful. And here, for example, if I wanted to see the top 15 household languages in New York City schools, you can click on different items to isolate different variables. So if I just wanted, for example, Spanish, French, and English, you could see that broken down by charter schools versus traditional public schools in New York City. And then if you wanted to go back to everything, just unhover everything. I did that for a few different data sets here. And then after that, you can see the number of students by race in New York City charter schools and traditional public schools. And it's the way the graph is so you can see how many students are at the school at the school total. If you zoom in, particularly here, you can break it down because the charter schools have so many less students, and you can kind of hover and see like the breakdown of students, which is cool. My team member and I, during that hackathon weekend, created a PowerPoint where we brought together all of our different findings and added a little bit of context. So I'll bring that up next. So first off, for our data contextualization, I think we did a good job here of linking to the data set we found. We found it on New York City Open Data. And we also talked about the tech stack we used, which I think is really good for transparency's sake, because you're able to talk about which technologies you used, how you use them, and how readers might replicate results on different data or when they expand the data set in the future. As far as the rest, I think that we could have added some more contextualization. We talked about it a little bit in our presentation here, but we essentially just put the titles a little bit abridged with the graphs. So as you can see, we have the racial makeup, student household languages, and then at the bottom, we excluded English, which then made the largest portion Spanish after that. And we went into different demographics about general ed versus special education students in traditional and charter public schools. And then also went into teacher training program grads by community poverty levels. Community poverty levels. Um, and we broke this down even more. And then also principal experience and the retention rates, which is definitely something interesting to look at as a lot of teachers have been leaving the fields in the past few years. Okay. Does anyone have, oh, was that sharing? My bad. This has all the graphs I've been talking through. You can get a general look at it. I didn't have too much context, but it was just the graph and title essentially. So as far as what I could have improved for context here versus what I did well, I think I did a good job of talking about the process in the slides, as well as linking with my teammate. But then the rest of the items could have had some more context about how they think that they related to the broader picture in New York City and the school system and any other cultural or historical data that would have made a difference there. Okay, the next example we're going to go to have linked here. Share screen. So the third example is the Marshall Project. The Marshall Project is a pretty cool website. They do a lot of data visualization on stories about criminal justice, specifically in the US. I don't know if, okay, I need to share my new tab. But here we go. And this is a really good example of data contextualization. So they have these dots up at the top, so you're able to read the visualization pretty easily and kind of see the incarceration rates across the country. Then as you scroll, the really cool part is that you're able to filter by your state. So if, for example, you're from, oh, it's in Alaska, so that's not going to work. If you go down and filter, you're in New York and you want to search for Kings County, you can see that's pulled up, and then you can see the data points for your specific county in your state. And they have the data from 2020 through 2000, and you can see the incarcerated share by county population as well. I think this is a cool tool because you're able to change how the data is sorted. So if you want to have it by just total number of incarcerated people, you're able to do that versus incarcerated share of the county population. And you're also able to alter, so you can find specifically how it applies not only to your state, but your county specifically. And they also have a lot of cool contextualization in this article, as it's a part of an article. Those are one of the best examples of, sorry about the screen. I've been switching around a lot. Here is the filter again. As I was talking about, they have it by both state and county. There's the graph on the right, as well as the specific geographic location. As I was talking about earlier, here's how you can kind of filter it. So it goes from incarcerated people to incarcerated share by county population. And then, for example, you want to go to Washington, you're in, I don't know the county for Seattle, but here's the different counties. You can scroll through and also see different counties around you as well. Another really cool thing to do is they have the option to download the data here in Observable, which is a great resource if you're curious about different aspects of the data and you want to learn more about it. And the Marshall Project does a really good job of kind of contextualizing the data. They have other data sets and articles down here. I think that journalism is a really interesting place for people to contextualize data and for this type of work because the projects themselves are already centered around kind of bringing the data and the information to the general public to educate them. So contextualizing data and creating interactive data visualizations is a really cool way to kind of bring that to life and allow people in the local community to learn more about the statistics and how they affect the people around them. So yes, that's my last data contextualization example. Does anyone have any questions or anything that like they thought like they did a good job of? Oh, my bad. Give me 1 second. My screen sharing is being a little weird. Okay, share screen. Okay, here we go. Awesome. The Marshall Project link. Yes, and I'll be sending out the slides after this. But if you're curious about the Marshall Project and you want to look at it a little bit further, yes, here you go. But I think these are really good ones. I used to work at a journalism a journalism lab on my university campus, and it was really interesting to see how data and technology integrated with journalism and how much context is really applied heavily in journalism. And it's interesting to see the data points and statistics being brought in. Yes. So I guess does anyone have, I guess, a favorite data project we looked at or anything like they thought that they want to definitely bring from this project into their future data presentations? Okay. I guess we'll be moving along then. So now I have some resources for learning more about data contextualization and kind of why providing data context is so important. Um, so these are some resources just about learning more about why it needs to be contextualized and kind of like how they're like some tenets on how to contextualize your data. On the left, there's two books, one called Data Feminism and one called Algorithms of Oppression. The first talks about kind of the need for data contextualization, especially for women, just due to historical data and the lack of data surrounding women in so many fields, specifically medical. It talks a good amount about that. And then the one below talks about how the algorithms and search engines are reinforcing racism, largely in part due to their biased historical data. And on the right, there's two logos. One is for the Algorithmic Justice League, sorry, which is a really cool organization. They do a lot of cool work surrounding data and machine learning and equity. They have a ton of really interesting articles around data contextualization and social good within machine learning on their website. And then the image above is from Coded Bias, which is a documentary. It was on Netflix, but I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix now. They take things off, on and off relatively frequently. But it's pretty interesting because it talks to different researchers and people about data contextualization and kind of the negative effects that using bad data or not testing things properly can have. For example, in the movie, a big tenet was that they talked about was how facial recognition wasn't recognizing this researcher's face until she quite literally put like a white mask on. And it was really cool to watch all of these researchers and people like talk about their interactions with machine learning in the real world, and specifically about how Dr. Joy talked to researchers at different tech companies and how they could improve the facial recognition technology. Aside from that, there's lots of resources. I'll send this out afterwards as well, so you can reference that. Some more resources for data contextualization. Back when I worked at the journalism lab, I created a data context checklist, which is a good starting point with a lot of questions to ask and things to consider when creating your data presentation or data visualizations. Also, I highly recommend the Plotly graphing library. It's an excellent resource to like very quickly create visualizations with code and just a few lines of code. And oh, it looks like my presentation. Okay. You're able to quickly create data visualizations with code, and they're aesthetically pleasing. You can add context, you can change things pretty easily so that you're able to better communicate the information to your audience. I also recommend Google Colab. That's the notebook I was in earlier with the New York City public school data. And that's just like a quick way to collaborate on data cleaning and visualizations without any installation needed. You can use Plotly within it. That's one of my favorite things to do. You can just upload your data sheet, or if it's a public source, you can just add the link when you're coding it. And it's a really cool way to collab with others and work on your data presentations together. Does anyone have any questions? What are some data sets that y'all think you'll probably be using this information to contextualize in the future? I know that I find contextualization of medical data sets to be really interesting, especially with COVID data sets. You're able to kind of relay the information that scientists are working on to the general public by explaining specific aspects. And it's a cool way to really make a difference because the information is so necessary for everyone to have. It looks like someone might be working with food data at their community school. That sounds like a really cool application. What kind of food data is about? I guess like food access, like the food growth. Be really interested in learning more about that. And if anyone else has any questions or any other cool data sets they want to talk about, you can put them in chat. Okay, they'll be talking about food quality materials. That sounds super interesting. Good luck. Yeah. I'll be sending out these slides in the Discord after this presentation, as well as the resources. If nobody else has any questions, then I think we'll be heading out. Thank you everyone so much for coming. And be sure to fill out the Global Hack Week link I sent out earlier to earn points for your guild. Thank you so much. Awesome. Bye, y'all.